Frost gathered on the windows of Pine Ridge long before November arrived, whispering warnings no one heeded. While neighbors hoarded firewood and oil, Clara Higgins built strange glass walls and buried pipes in the frozen dirt. Fools called her crazy. Winter, however, would soon prove who the real fool was. Pine Ridge, Montana was a town that respected two things: hard work and a massive stockpile of winter fuel. Nestled deep within the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Mountains, the community survived the grueling 6-month winters by relying on roaring hearths and sputtering diesel generators. If you didn't have a towering stack of split oak by Halloween, you were practically writing your own obituary. Clara Higgins, a 62-year-old retired structural engineer, had no wood. Worse than having no wood, Clara had spent the entire summer hiring contractors from 3 towns over to dismantle the magnificent stone chimney of her hilltop cabin. It was an act the locals considered equivalent to tearing out one's own lungs right before a marathon. Down at Miller's Diner, the dismantling of Clara's chimney was the only thing on the menu. Absalom Blake, a man whose voice was as loud as his flannel shirts, leaned over his black coffee and scoffed. "I drove past her place yesterday," Absalom told Mayor Thomas Woolbright, gesturing with a half-eaten piece of toast. "She's got a backhoe digging a trench 10 feet deep in her front yard. Says she's laying down earth tubes. I asked her what she's going to burn when the mercury hits 20 below. You know what she said?" Thomas took a slow sip of his coffee. "Enlighten me, Absalom." She said, "Nothing. Said fire is an obsolete hazard." Absalom barked a laugh that echoed off the linoleum walls. "She's going to freeze to death by Christmas. Mark my words. I just hope we don't have to wait till the spring thaw to chip her out of her living room." Clara was not deaf to the town's mockery, but she had long stopped caring about the opinions of men whose understanding of physics stopped at striking a match. 10 years prior, Clara had lost her husband Richard to a catastrophic house fire caused by a faulty flue and a rogue spark. She had barely escaped with her life, carrying severe burns on her left shoulder and a permanent paralyzing terror of open flames. When she relocated to Pine Ridge to find peace, she swore she would never allow a spark of fire inside her walls again. Instead of splitting logs, Clara spent her autumn applying the principles of extreme passive solar design and geothermal retention. She had replaced the entire southern-facing wall of her cabin with triple-glazed, argon-filled windows. Behind the glass, she constructed a massive trombe wall, a dense structure of cinder blocks filled with sand and painted matte black to absorb the sun's radiation during the short daylight hours. While Absalom and Thomas were breaking their backs stacking cords of wood, Clara was packing hundreds of copper tubes with paraffin wax and burying them in her walls of phase-change material that would absorb excess heat during the day and slowly release it as it solidified at night. Her 10-foot-deep trenches housed a closed-loop geothermal ventilation system, drawing air through the earth where the temperature remained a constant, steadfast 55 degrees, regardless of the blizzards above. To the untrained eye, she was building a bizarre, smokeless mausoleum. By late October, the first flurries began to fall. The town of Pine Ridge synchronized its collective routine. The heavy thwack of axes, the roar of chainsaws, and the dark, thick plumes of wood smoke rising from every rooftop in the valley. Every rooftop, of course, except Clara's. Her roof was lined with a pristine layer of white snow, undisturbed by the heat of a fire. Sarah Jenkins, the young waitress from the diner, felt a twinge of pity. One afternoon, wrapping her scarf tightly around her neck, she hiked up the hill to Clara's property, carrying a basket of warm muffins and a subtle intention to check on the older woman's mental state. "Clara," Sarah called out, stepping onto the wraparound porch. The wind was already biting, carrying the distinct metallic scent of an approaching front. Clara opened the door, dressed comfortably in a light cotton long-sleeve shirt and jeans. No heavy wool, no shivering. "Sarah, what a lovely surprise. Come in quickly. Don't let the draft in." Stepping over the threshold, Sarah braced herself for the icy chill she had been warned about. Instead, a wave of gentle, profound warmth enveloped her. It wasn't the harsh, dry, skin-cracking heat of a wood stove, but an even, radiating comfort that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. It's warm in here," Sarah stammered, looking around frantically for a hidden space heater. "How?" Clara smiled, taking the muffins. She pointed to the massive black stone wall basking in the low afternoon sun, and then to the discreet vents near the floorboards. "The earth provides, Sarah. The sun pays the heating bill, and the dirt keeps the change. The ground below the frost line is a battery of warmth. I'm just circulating it." Sarah left feeling thoroughly confused but relieved. However, when she reported back to the diner that Clara was perfectly warm, Absalom waved it off. "It's only October," he grunted, slamming a meaty hand on the counter. "Wait until the Siberian Express rolls through. That fancy dirt air won't save her when the real cold bites." Absalom didn't know it yet, but the real cold wasn't just going to bite. It was going to devour them all. Meteorologists called it a generational anomaly. The locals would later call it the White Goliath. In the second week of December, a colossal high-pressure system from the Arctic collided with a moisture-rich Pacific storm directly over the Bitterroot Mountains. It didn't just bring snow, it brought atmospheric violence. It began on a Tuesday evening. The temperature in Pine Ridge plummeted from a manageable 20 degrees to -30 in the span of 4 hours. The wind howled at 80 miles per hour, ripping shingles from roofs and transforming the falling snow into millions of horizontal, flesh-shredding needles. Within the first hour, the aging power grid of Pine Ridge surrendered. A chorus of transformers popped like distant gunfire across the valley, plunging the entire town into terrifying darkness. Absalom Blake sat in his living room, wrapped in a heavy quilt, staring at his wood stove. He wasn't panicked. This was precisely why he had chopped 5 cords of premium ash and oak. He lit a match, tossed it into the tinder, and watched the flames lick upward. "Let it snow," he muttered to himself, pouring a glass of bourbon. But Mother Nature had woven a lethal twist into the White Goliath. The extreme rapid drop in temperature had created a violent atmospheric inversion over the valley. The cold air was so impossibly dense and heavy that it acted like a physical lid pressing down on the town. When Absalom's fire grew, the smoke didn't draft up the chimney. Instead, the crushing downdraft of sub-zero air forced its way down the flue. A thick, blinding cloud of acrid black smoke violently billowed out of the stove, filling Absalom's living room in seconds. Coughing violently, his eyes tearing up, Absalom tried to force the flue open wider, but the downdraft was relentless. The cold air pouring down the chimney was actually putting the fire out, replacing the heat with -30-degree wind and choking exhaust. Panicked, Absalom grabbed a bucket of snow from his porch and threw it on the logs, killing the fire. He stood in the freezing, smoke-filled dark, his breath pluming in the air. "What the hell?" he wheezed. Across town, Mayor Thomas Albright was experiencing the exact same nightmare. He tried his oil furnace, but the brutal cold had gelled the diesel fuel in the outdoor tank, turning it into useless, waxy sludge. When he tried his backup fireplace, the same lethal downdraft blew ash and smoke back into his face, triggering the carbon monoxide detectors, which screamed their high-pitched warnings until the freezing batteries died. By midnight, the temperature had reached -42 degrees Fahrenheit. The town of Pine Ridge was paralyzed. They had endless mountains of wood, but lighting a fire meant suffocating to death in their own homes. Without fire, their poorly insulated, drafty houses were rapidly becoming meat lockers. Water pipes burst with loud cracks, flooding basements with water that turned to solid ice within minutes. Fear, cold and sharp, replaced the town's usual arrogance. Dawn broke, though the sun was entirely obscured by the raging blizzard. The wind chill was estimated at -60. Hypothermia was beginning to set in across the valley. Families huddled together under piles of blankets, their teeth chattering violently, their skin taking on a dangerous pallid blue hue. Absalom Blake, shivering so hard his ribs ached, realized he had to seek help. He wrapped his face in 3 wool scarves, donned his heavy parka and snowshoes, and forced his way out the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow to the chest, immediately freezing the moisture in his nostril. He blindly navigated the whiteout conditions toward Mayor Albright's house, only to find Thomas and his wife huddled in the center of their living room, wrapped in an old down comforter, shivering uncontrollably. We can't burn anything," Thomas choked out, his lips violently purple. "The smug, it comes right back down. We're going to freeze, Absalom." Absalom's mind raced. The roads out of town were buried under 10 feet of snowdrifts. The emergency services couldn't get in. The plows were frozen shut. The town was entirely cut off, and their only source of heat had betrayed them. Then, through the blinding white haze of his frozen eyelashes, Absalom looked up the hill. Clara Higgins' house sat silently on the ridge. There was, as always, no smoke coming from a chimney, because she didn't have one. "Clara," Absalom gasped. She doesn't use a fire. She doesn't need a chimney to draft." Thomas looked at him, his eyes wide with a mix of desperate hope and lingering skepticism. "Absalom, her house is made of glass and dirt. She's probably been dead since midnight." "I have to check," Absalom said, his voice muffled through the frozen wall. "If she's dead, maybe her house is at least out of the wind. If she's alive, God help us, maybe she was right." The trek up the hill took Absalom 45 minutes, fighting against thigh-deep snow and a wind that actively tried to push him back down. By the time he reached Kara's porch, he couldn't feel his fingers or toes. His vision was blurring at the edges, the final terrifying stage before hypothermia claims consciousness. He stumbled onto her porch, shielded slightly from the wind by her heavy storm doors. He looked at the massive glass walls. Frost heavily coated the outside of the panes, but through a small gap in the ice, Absalom saw something that defied all logic. Green leaves. Clara's indoor ferns were thriving. There was no frost on the inside of the glass. Gathering the absolute last ounce of strength he possessed, Absalom pounded his heavy, frozen fist against her solid oak door. "Clara!" He screamed, though his voice was little more than a raspy croak over the howling wind. "Clara, please." A moment later, the deadbolt clicked. The heavy door swung inward. Absalom fell forward, collapsing onto the entryway floor. As he hit the hardwood, he didn't feel the biting sting of -40 degrees. He felt the impossible, miraculous embrace of 65-degree air. Clara stood above him, holding a steaming mug of peppermint tea. She wasn't wearing a coat. She was wearing a pair of corduroy slippers and a knitted cardigan. "Absalom," Clara said softly, her voice steady and completely devoid of the "I told you so" he knew he deserved. She knelt down, touching his frozen shoulder. "Let's get you out of those wet clothes. The heat from the Trombow wall is peaking." Absalom laid his head against the warm wooden floorboards, tears of sheer relief mixing with the melting snow on his face. He had mocked her. The whole town had mocked her, and right now her smokeless, fireless house was the only thing standing between him and a frozen grave. "Clara," Absalom whispered, his teeth still chattering as he looked up at the older woman. The draft won't let us burn wood. Everyone is dying." Clara's expression hardened. She looked past him, staring out the glass door at the apocalyptic whiteout swallowing Pine Ridge. She had designed this house to be an isolated fortress for one. She hadn't designed it to be an ark. But as she looked down at the burly, arrogant man trembling helplessly on her floor, she knew there was only one choice. "Well," Clara said, setting her mud down and walking over to a large closet, "I suppose it's a good thing I built the floors with a high thermal mess. We have a lot of body heat to harvest." She pulled out an armful of emergency thermal blankets. "Catch your breath, Absalom. Then we're going back out there to get the rest of them." Clara did not hesitate. She handed Absalom a spare pair of insulated, battery-heated gloves from her mudroom and strapped a pair of wide-set aluminum snowshoes to her own boots. "We take the sled," she instructed, pointing to a heavy-duty fiberglass utility toboggan she usually used for hauling compost. "We bring the weakest first. Children, the elderly. We don't have time for debates." Stepping back out into the teeth of the storm was like walking into a solid wall of razor blades. The wind chill had pushed past -65, a temperature where exposed flesh freezes solid in under 2 minutes. Their first stop was the Albright residence. Thomas and his wife Martha had retreated to their basement, desperately huddling beneath a pile of rugs, but the concrete walls were radiating pure frost. Martha was barely conscious, her lips a frightening shade of slate gray. Absalom practically carried her to the sled, wrapping her in Kara's mylar thermal blankets, while Thomas stumbled blindly behind them, gripping the tow rope for dear life. For 4 agonizing hours, Clara and Absalom made trips up and down the ridge. They dragged Sarah Jenkins from her freezing apartment above the diner. They pulled the Miller family, all 5 of them, out of a home where the bursting pipes had turned the living room into a skating rink. By 4 a.m., 32 people were crammed into Clara's open-concept living space. It was a surreal sight. The town's toughest critics, the men who had openly guffawed at her dirt air and glass walls, were now packed shoulder to shoulder on her heated hardwood floors, weeping quietly as feeling painfully returned to their extremities. The cabin's internal temperature dropped initially as the freezing bodies absorbed the ambient heat, but then the genius of Clara's design engaged. The massive, black-painted Trombe wall released the deep, penetrating thermal energy it had stored from the previous week's sunlight. Furthermore, 32 human bodies generate an enormous amount of latent heat, roughly 100 watts per person. Clara's house, insulated to the extreme specifications pioneered by real-world physicist Dr. Wolfgang Feist, trapped every single watt. Within an hour, the temperature inside stabilized at a miraculous 58 degrees. People were shedding their heavy, snow-caked coats. Sarah Jenkins sat by the indoor ferns, staring in awe at the frost raging futilely against the exterior of the triple-paned glass. "You saved us, Clara," Mayor Thomas whispered, clutching a cup of room-temperature water. His voice trembled with a mixture of profound gratitude and deep shame. "We were fools." Clara stood near the kitchen island, monitoring a digital gauge on the wall. She didn't smile. Her eyes were fixed on a rising red line on the display. "Don't celebrate yet, Thomas. We have a new problem." Absalom, exhausted and slumped against the kitchen counter, looked up. "What problem?" "It's warm. The wind can't get in." "Exactly," Clara said, her voice tight with rising dread. "The wind can't get in. Nothing can get in. This house was built to be completely airtight, utilizing a Zenda energy recovery ventilator to exchange fresh air without losing heat. It's calibrated for 1 occupant, maybe 2. She turned the gauge around so Absalom and Thomas could see it. It was a CO2 monitor. "There are 32 panicking, heavy-breathing people in a sealed box," Clara explained grimly. "The carbon dioxide levels are skyrocketing. Normal outdoor air is 400 parts per million. We just crossed 2,500. When it hits 5,000, people will start getting severe headaches and nausea. At 10,000, we fall unconscious. Eventually, we suffocate." A murmur of panic rippled through the nearest huddled neighbors. "So we crack a window," Absalom said, moving toward the glass wall. "No," Clara snapped, physically blocking him. "If you open that window, the -60-degree downdraft will violently pull the warm air out and flood this room with lethal cold. The thermal mass will freeze, the plants will die, and we will all succumb to hypothermia in under 30 minutes. The heating system relies on a closed loop." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice hitching with fresh terror. The air in the room was indeed beginning to feel thick, heavy, and stale. A dull throbbing was already pulsing behind Absalom's temples. "The ERB draws fresh air through the earth tubes buried in the yard," Clara said, pointing to the floor vents. "The air travels through 100 feet of buried copper piping, warming up to the Earth's 55 degrees before it enters the house. But the intake valve in the yard has a motorized restrictor plate, governed by the system to only let in a sip of air at a time." Clara grabbed a heavy flashlight and a pry bar from a drawer. "I need to go into the mechanical crawl space beneath the floorboards and manually rip the restrictor plate out of the main duct. But even if I do that, the system won't pull enough air if the external intake pipe in the yard is buried under 10 feet of snow." She looked directly at Absalom. "I need someone to go back outside, find the intake pipe near the oak tree, and dig it out. And they have to keep it clear of the drifting snow until this storm breaks." Absalom looked at the frosted windows. The blizzard outside sounded like a freight train screaming off its tracks. Stepping back out there wasn't a rescue mission. It was a suicide detail. "I'll do it," Absalom said, his voice surprisingly steady. He owed this woman his life. He owed her the lives of his neighbors. "I'm going with you," Mayor Thomas interjected, struggling to his feet. "Two men dig faster than one." Clara nodded slowly. She fetched a heavy nylon climbing rope, tying one end securely around Absalom's waist and the other around Thomas. "The intake is a stainless steel periscope structure, about 50 feet due south of the porch. You have to dig down to the mesh grate and clear the ice. Take these." She handed them heavy ionized chippers. "You have about 20 minutes out there before your corneas begin to freeze," Clara warned, her eyes locking with Absalom's. "Do not stay longer. If you feel warm, it means you are dying. Pull the rope, and the men inside will haul you back." As Absalom and Thomas braced themselves at the front door, Clara descended into the dark, claustrophobic crawl space beneath the cabin. Absalom pushed the door open, and the white Goliath roared, immediately slamming him back against the frame. He and Thomas fought their way out, leaning forward at sharp angles just to remain standing. The cold was instantly paralyzing, and the snow was blowing horizontally, creating a chaotic white void that erased the landscape entirely. Absalom counted his paces. 10, 20, 30. The snow was waist-deep, burying his legs in a freezing vise. Every breath he took felt like inhaling shattered glass. Beside him, Thomas was already faltering, his movements sluggish. Down in the crawl space, Clara wriggled on her back through the narrow gap between the floor joists and the dirt. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the massive insulated steel trunk line of the Zender ventilation unit. She found the restrictor valve, a metal housing, bolted shut. Her hands were trembling, not from cold, but from adrenaline. She wedged the pry bar under the steel flange and pulled with all her might. Crack. The metal sheared, and Clara violently wrenched the restrictor plate out of the housing. Immediately, she felt a massive vacuum pressure inside the pipe, desperately trying to suck air from the outside world. But the airflow was weak, strained, and choked. "The intake is buried," Clara thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hurry, Absalom, please." Above ground, Absalom hit the 50-foot mark. He dropped to his knees, blindly plunging his thick gloves into the snowbank. "Dig!" he screamed at Thomas, though the sound was completely swallowed by the shrieking wind. They dug like wild dogs, 3 feet down. 4 feet. Absalom's ice chipper struck something solid with a dull clink. Metal. Metal. He frantically cleared the snow away, revealing the domed top of the intake pipe. But to his absolute horror, the mesh grate wasn't just covered in snow, it was encased in a solid 4-inch thick block of solid blue ice. The moisture from the storm had frozen instantly upon contact with the metal. Absalom swung the heavy iron chipper. It bounced off the ice, jarring his arms so violently he nearly dropped the tool. He swung again, harder. Chips of ice flew into his face. His arms felt like lead. The edges of his vision were going dark. Hypothermia was setting in rapidly, convincing his brain that lying down in the snow would be comfortable. No, Absalom thought, biting his own lip until he tasted warm copper just to stay awake. She built the ark. I just have to open the window. He raised the iron bar high above his head and brought it down with a primal, desperate roar. Crunch. The iron cracked through the icebox, shattering it into dozens of pieces. Instantly, Absalom heard a loud, violent, rushing sound, a deep, hollow whoosh, as the vacuum pressure from the house finally found its release. Millions of cubic feet of sub-zero air rushed past him, diving down into the pipe, hurtling into the earth tubes. Down in the crawl space, Clara was blasted in the face with a gale-force wind shooting out of the duct. But as the air moved through the 100 feet of buried copper piping, a thermodynamic miracle occurred. The 55-degree Earth aggressively transferred its heat to the negative 60-degree air. By the time the blast of wind hit Kara's face, it wasn't a lethal freezing gust. It was a crisp, breathable 45 degrees. It was the breath of the Earth. Inside the living room, the floor vents roared to life. Fresh, oxygen-rich air flooded the crowded room. Sarah Jenkins, who had been slumping into unconsciousness against the glass wall, suddenly gasped, her eyes flying open as the heavy, suffocating feeling in her chest vanished. The CO2 monitor plummeted rapidly back down to safe levels. Outside, Absalom and Thomas collapsed in the snow. The men at the door felt the slack on the rope and hauled furiously, dragging the two half-frozen men back across the porch and into the life-saving warmth of the cabin. For 3 days and 3 nights, the White Goliath battered Pine Ridge. 32 people lived inside Clara's glass and dirt fortress. They survived on Sarah's muffins, Clara's pantry staples, and water melted from snow harvested carefully from the porch. The geothermal tubes constantly fed them fresh, breathable air, while the Trombi wall and their collective body heat maintained a comfortable temperature that defied the apocalyptic freeze outside. On the morning of the 4th day, the screaming wind finally died. The sun broke over the Bitterroot Mountains, casting a brilliant, blinding light across a totally unrecognizable landscape. Pine Ridge was buried under 12 feet of snow. The power grid was a mangled ruin. When the National Guard helicopters finally managed to land on the ridge 2 days later, the rescue crews expected to find a town of frozen corpses. Instead, they found a trail of surviving residents systematically digging out their neighbors, entirely organized and coordinated by a woman in a knitted cardigan and a burly man in a flannel shirt. The town of Pine Ridge survived. But the paradigm had irrevocably shifted. The following summer, the roar of chainsaws in the valley was significantly quieter. Instead, the hills echoed with the deep, rhythmic thud of backhoes digging 10-foot trenches. Absalom Blake was the first in line at the hardware store, buying miles of copper tubing and paraffin wax. No one mocked Clara Higgins ever again. They knew the truth. Fire was fragile and wood burned to ash. But the earth beneath their feet was a silent, eternal furnace, and Clara had simply been the only one wise enough to ask it for a light. Are you ready to rethink how you survive the winter? Nature's power is absolute, but human ingenuity is limitless. If Clara's brilliant, smokeless survival story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who thinks chopping wood is the only way to stay warm, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-to-life survival dramas.